As we looked around the universe at the different swarms, each of them was contained by one reason or another. The majority of them was for the fact they couldn't leave their own planet. Others didn't have any interest of reaching beyond their own sector, and one in particular decided that it just did not want to be bothered, yet shown that if bothered, it would be like kicking a nest of some sort of insectoids and just watching them destroy whoever had kicked the nest. We realized this as we watched over the humans with great interest, keeping our probes outside of their territory, as whenever one entered, immediately one of the swarm would come at it and destroy it. It didn't matter if the probe had returned back to our space. We were told specifically to stay out. Some decided that they wanted to probe the area more and more, deeper in, but most of them were told by their governments to not even think about it, as the swarm created by the humans was far too dangerous, because the worst thing that we had thought possible was a thinking swarm. We were wrong. On the other side of the known universe, something had stirred. Another swarm that had come up. In this case, true insectoids had come out, and they had found a way of not only getting off their planet, but reaching beyond their own sectors into others. And with that, they seemed to be building a hierarchy. As soon as they landed on a planet, they began to consume, creating their own nests, starting to lay their eggs as soon as they possibly could. Many times they would simply harvest genetic material from the local fauna or flora, and they would use it to increase their numbers. Not only that, but the resulting mutations would be something absolutely horrifying. Many of our own were scared that eventually they would get on our own DNA, but there were several other species between us and them, so many of them in the Galactic Council did not even take it seriously. We believed that the swarm itself would eventually burn itself out, reach critical mass, and then do what every species does when it reaches critical mass: retract. There wouldn't be an explosion. They would simply expand as far as they wanted to, and then realize they expanded a little too far, and then withdraw. This happens with every species out there, except for, of course, those that trade in goods. But aside from that, there was no reason for any species to reach beyond their borders. There was plenty of land. There was plenty of resources. There was plenty of whatever they needed within their own territories. Yet, this new swarm did not seem to care. It did not follow the same rules that everyone else did. It seemed as though the laws of nature were tossed to the side, straight into the local star, and burned up because it didn't matter. This swarm continued, and before we realized it, two of the species that we had known for almost a millennia were no longer there. The swarm had reached them. The swarm had been able to somehow get into their space and get to their even home planets and strip them clean of all life. Many of these planets were no more than just barren rock once the insects were done with them. These insectoids were very dangerous, ranging from approximately 1 meter tall by 1 meter back from nose to tail to easily 10 meters tall. This frightened us beyond all measure as we saw that it was just constantly changing its form. Every time it reached a new species, there was a new one of the insectoids to deal with. And we believed that if we pulled our resources, we could stop them cold. And for a time, we did. For a time, we stopped their advance. For a time, all our fleets assembled and went against the insectoid fleets. And as they came into the sector, riding in on some sort of energy that we do not understand, we would simply begin to fire. No quarter was ever given. If it was one of our ships, if it was believed that was infected, it wouldn't matter the cries for help. We couldn't risk one of our own battleships being taken. And that ship, even though screeching for help, would be immediately cleansed from the galaxy. The swarm, however, was unrelenting, and for every one of our ships lost, we put down 5,000 or 6,000 of theirs, but it was never enough. The swarm itself continued to grow faster and stronger, and soon they sent more and more fleets at the same time, flanking our battle groups, forcing them to retreat farther back, giving up space for time. They fought as best as they could. The fleets combined, along with whatever reserves they could scavenge. They used all sorts of weapons, all sorts of anything they could find. It was horrific. Absolutely horrific what was done. Many of them were grabbed a hold of and dragged into the hive dens. We didn't know what was going on, but the screams of help and then sometimes screams of pain, we could only imagine what was being done to them. And we would not sit there and watch. We tried to glass several planets and turn them into molten slag, but this took more resources and more time than we could manage. Eventually, we realized that the swarm had reached towards our own borders, and at this time, at least one more species was no longer in our galaxy. A few remnants here and there, refugees, but they would not last much longer as they could not reproduce with any others except their own species. We tried to bring them together to try and save them, but more and more of the shuttles were being caught by the swarm and turned into the swarm's food. We saw all the videos. Many of our children would wake up screaming at night, worrying that the swarm was coming. The swarm was going to take them. The swarm was going to consume all. And when it was brought up, what could they do to fight this enemy? An enemy that all of us combined at our peak could not keep from breaking down the gates of our castle and storming in. What could we possibly do to take them? How could we possibly stop them, let alone push them back? And then it was decided we would ask another swarm to fight. At first, we tried with a few other insectoid races that did not have the intelligence, and many of our ambassadors were simply consumed on that planet, and their vehicles torn to pieces. So we were left with one single choice. I will still remember that day when the Grand Chancellor just screamed out, "Fuck it! Contact the humans!" Everyone there was afraid. Everyone had seen what the humans had done, and they knew that the humans wanted nothing more than to be left alone within their own territories. We knew that our probes were immediately targeted the moment they passed into human territory. We realized that the humans were so dangerous. But what other choice did we have? To save ourselves from annihilation, we would make a deal with the devil. Deep inside human space, the command received all the messages from each of the remaining species, all of them begging for assistance. It was originally thought of as a joke, something to let down their defenses. Humans were very xenophobic at this point, and did not want anything to do with them. But that was until the videos started flowing in. The videos were sent in on broad spectrum bands so that anyone could pick them up. It wasn't in any way, shape, or form altered, they could tell. And not only being authentic, but it was seen by anyone who had a receiver. The videos of the insectoid species rummaging through entire urban areas, tearing families apart, watching as many of them were ripped limb from limb, some of them being dragged, kicking and screaming into the hive itself, some of them screaming for mommy and daddy as they watched their parents be torn apart as they desperately tried to hold the insectoids back, but it didn't matter if there was a mountain of carapace in front of them. They just could not keep them back. Humanity, as xenophobic as they were, could not stand for this. And one video stuck out amongst all of them. It was inside what they believed was a hospital, as they could see several of their versions of doctors trying to treat their own, and they were desperately trying to deal with all the lost limbs, many screaming on the floor. They watched in the sides as many of them bled out. The doctors screaming for whatever materials they could have, but they didn't have any. And as the insectoids started breaking in the walls, the doctors never stopped working. One of them still working, trying to sew up his patient, as when the insectoid shoved its spike through the doctor's back. The doctor seemingly trying desperately to stay on his work as he focused and tried desperately to fix the man he was working on. But a moment later, another insectoid came and crushed the man on the gurney and began to consume it. A woman was off in the corner, screaming, holding her child. She tried desperately to leave, but the passages were blocked. There were so many people trying to leave that everything was bound up. The insectoids began to grab a hold of many of the civilians as they pulled them back and began to crunch down on them, leaving piles of different colored blood all over the place. Screams were left in all different areas, all different languages, and no one could see what was going on. The cameraman, whoever was holding it, must have been taken down because the camera hit the floor, and in a sort of sideways, almost 48 degrees, maybe 50-degree turn, it sat there and watched as one of the insectoids walked up very slow to the mother as it held the infant. The insectoid raised several of its appendages, reached out and slammed into the mother's shoulder. She wailed in pain. The child began to cry, and as she began to lose consciousness, this insectoid reached up with several of its forelimbs and yanked the child from her arms. She was trying desperately to reach for the child, but she was running out of blood extremely fast. And with that, the insectoid not only raised the child up, but then dropped it into its maw, and with a mighty crunch, you actually heard the insectoid coo in a pleasant noise. This was enough. Everyone on humanity knew there was several rules you did not break. You don't shoot at Doc, and you don't hurt kids. Everyone was incensed by this, and as they saw the end of the video, as the woman screeched in agony watching her child be taken, the insectoid seemingly turned and ripped her open, eviscerating her, dropping her guts all over the ground, and seemingly watching as she slowly faded off from sudden, rapid blood loss. That is where the video ended. The vote came down. They wanted to know who was ready to go to war. Was humanity willing to go to war? They'd almost lost so much already. Were they willing? Were they ready? Did they want to fight? Do they want to put their lives on the line for aliens, for Xenos? Xenos that had thought of them nothing more than little pink monkeys. The vote will come down within 24 hours. Back towards the front line, many of the ships desperately fired into the insectoid race as they came in. Their massive motherships were big, bulbous, some sort of organic material. As they seemingly moved up, it was almost impossible for them to pierce the carapace of whatever the hell it was without coordinated fire. They coordinated as best they could, but they didn't have many of their battleships anymore, as many of them had already been taken out and they just couldn't build them fast enough. Many of the commanders kept telling everyone to fire as best they could, stay in formation, but continue to withdraw so they did not continue to lose ships. They were desperate. They were extremely desperate, and as they began to lose colony after colony, they knew they only had a few choices. And this is when the order was given for them to give their lives and give their last to protect them. It would be about 10 minutes of sub-FTL flight to crash into them, as they were too close to the star to activate their FTL engines. How could they possibly do this? How could it come down to this? One of the ship captains, in charge of a simple corvette, told his helmsman to head straight for the mothership. They would drive right into it and blow every last piece of ordnance they could, using the engines to overload and scorch that thing if it had to. If they were lucky, they would break the carapace before the engine exploded, and then they could blow the engines on the inside. At least that would stop the mothership, or at bare minimum slow it down, and possibly halt the invasion so the rest of the refugees could get off. This was the reason for the delaying action, as they were trying to get enough time for the refugees to board ships and get the hell off those planets. The problem is there wasn't enough ships. So what could they do? They had one choice. The only thing they could do now was a delaying action. A straight-up kamikaze mission straight into the heart of the swarm, and as they powered up their engines, everyone got ready, and on the signal they all charged forward. And as they got closer, 3 minutes out, 2 minutes out, many of them screaming as their weapons were running extremely hot, trying desperately to keep the smaller bugs from stopping them from reaching onto their own target, they saw something on their sensors. A burst of something showed up on the edge of their sensors, but it wasn't just on the edge of their sensors. It was getting closer. Something huge and bulbous was there. They couldn't figure out what the hell it was. Many of the captains started cursing, "Oh no, oh no. The insectoids have brought reinforcements." As they looked on the scanners, they realized that that's exactly what happens. The insectoids had brought an even larger mothership. How could they possibly defend on this? This force was big enough that it could take down every single colony, every single one of their homeworlds without even slowing down, no matter what they threw at it. As they started to pray, the captain screamed at them to steadfast themselves and take down as many of them to hell as possible. How could this come to this? And that's when it happened. Alarms started going off. Incoming ordnance. From where? They had no idea. Incoming ordnance. Incoming ordnance. From where? They couldn't see anything on their sensors. And then all of a sudden, from seemingly everywhere, there was all sorts of small ordnance coming in. Some of it was not so small and moving at a large fraction of the speed of light as it screamed through the night sky. But of course, you couldn't hear it in space. The visual sensors were the only thing that could pick it up. They looked over and they saw large hunks of shiny metals flying through space. Behind them was other piece of metals being pushed on by fusion torches, going faster and faster, actually starting to outpace the hunks of metal. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Along with that, small fighters, seemingly so small that even their own people wouldn't be able to fit inside, covered in weapons, were flying past them. And behind that, another row of mechanical devices being used with fusion torches. What the hell was going on? And then they got the word. The same word came through on every single channel through every single language. Wave off, break off your attack. Say again, break off your attack now. The reinforcements are here. They couldn't believe what was going on. Then suddenly the sensors pinged and they saw a huge mass of ships coming in. This huge mass of ships matched the new fleet of insectoids that had come in. Did it truly match? Could they actually go one-on-one? Wait a moment. The captain looked down at the radar and then to his radar man said, Is this true? Is this it? Sir, there's even more. What? He looked on the radar, and behind the larger of the insectoid fleet, another group of blips came in, but these were not insectoids. These were the same type of mechanical ships that were before. They were also firing God knows how much ordnance. It was so much that no machine could even think of tracking so much. And before they even had a chance, the message came in for them to wave off. And with that, they did a flip and burn and got the hell out of Dodge as fast as they could. They looked and all the rest of their ships were doing the same. As these new ships came in and began to fire all sorts of ordnance, more fighters came out and they were firing in all different directions. Multiple weapons were firing everywhere, and as they got closer to the larger ships, they began to fire even larger ordnance that seemed to be hanging off the pillars on the ventral and dorsal side. These small devices seemed to penetrate inside the insectoid ships and then explode, and this was behind all the initial strikes that came up already. It was insane. As they looked on their sensors, they couldn't figure out what was going on, so they switched to visuals and going for maximum magnification. They watched as the smaller of the insectoid fleet was now being torn to ribbons. They realized that the massive ship there was actually a large insectoid itself. It seemed to finally raise its head from its curled position and seemed as though it was trying to scream as it opened its mouth. But as it did, more ordnance flew into its mouth and seemed to explode inside of its neck. All sorts of goop was sprayed across space as suddenly the whole thing just exploded. They couldn't believe what was going on. The rest of that small fleet was quickly destroyed and decimated. They looked over. They couldn't figure out who this new ally was. All they saw was a bunch of strange-looking flying bricks as they flew through space, not seeming to even care of the people they had just saved. They just whipped past at speeds that they couldn't understand. How could they move that fast at sublight speeds? Are they using their FTL engines to move that quick at sublight? And look at how they're maneuvering. You can't maneuver like that in space and still be alive. What the hell is going on? Before they knew it, the larger fleet was already being engaged. They turned their cameras over and they watched as the large bulbous thing was starting to get peppered with all sorts of ordnance. More of those rods went in, but not only was it being hit from the front, but right in the back. It seemed to want to uncurl itself, but as it started to curl itself back up again. This was strange. They didn't understand even know how in the hell were they able to do an FTL jump inside of a bug. This doesn't make sense. How could this make any sort of sense? But then they thought about it. Could it be that they just absorbed a species that can do that and mixed it in with their DNA? They didn't have time to think about this as they watched those two fleets of unknown origin just crush in on the new insectoid fleet, squeezing on it like a nutcracker on a walnut, and then the insectoid fleet broke. They all seemed to start freaking out and aiming for anyone. They tried to get close to the new ships, and the new ships just started to target them with point defense systems, cutting them to ribbons. The point defense systems, along with any energy weapons that were firing, were like giant glowing whips through space that would swipe across. Seemingly unable to use them constantly, they began to fire more and more of their some sort of ballistic weapons or something else with a fusion torch shoved up its ass. They didn't know what was going on, nor did they care, but this new ally, whoever it was, had just torn apart the largest insectoid fleet. And as the fire died down, the commander of the Allied fleet called out, "Thank you for assistance, but who are you?" "This is Admiral Coltrane of the human fleet. We heard you needed some help, so we're here." Everyone was flabbergasted and not able to speak. Across every single one of the bridges, everyone looked at each other. Humans? Humans were exceptionally dangerous. What were they doing? And since recently they were considered the most dangerous species in the known universe, why were they here protecting them now? What the hell was going on? With that, everyone began to contact their own government to see what the hell was going on. The only thing they got from the humans was a request to see any casualties, to know who needed assistance and where the refugees were. Once this message was sent on where the refugees were, another smaller group of fleet came in. Not really a battle group. These seemed to be some sort of cargo vessels. All of them decorated with a strange symbol, a red bar that was both vertical and horizontal was painted on it. It also let off a very wide electronic signature, as though it was telling everybody where it was. They went down towards where the refugees were and simply asked for clearance to land as close to refugees as possible. No one dared refuse the humans. and they moved many of their own ships so they could land. And to everyone's absolute shock, as soon as the doors opened upon landing, they began to bring out all sorts of supplies: food, water purification, medical supplies, shelter. Everything they would need for survival was brought out to them and set up with mechanical precision. So mechanical, everybody thought that all those in front of them were robots. But as it turns out, only about 80% of them were. The rest were straight humans. They didn't understand this, but then they remembered what was going on, that everyone said that the human swarm was more than just biological, it was mechanical as well. This is what made them so dangerous, is they went beyond their own limits. They realized what they needed to do to protect themselves, and AI was a big portion to that. Before anybody even realized, hospitals were set up, the sick were being treated, the wounded were being fixed. They brought in strange machines that seemingly forced their own bodies to regenerate. Some of the warriors that had lost arms or legs found themselves regenerated with a full arm or leg on them, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. Though it would take a long time before the atrophy would wear off and they were able to build some sort of strength in it, they were amazed that they now had all their limbs, in some cases growing back their eyes so they could see, and a few were just great to have their antennas back. With this, the humans were looked at as a sign from all that was good that there was a chance. There was a chance. The insectoids seemed to realize what was going on as their own fleets went dark. They seemed to mass all their fleets together, not even trying to hide what they were doing. It was though they were trying to challenge the humans for a straight-up slugfest to see who had the better swarm. And the humans did not disappoint. They began to bring all their warships, leaving their medical and support ships behind. Every fighter, corvette, frigate, destroyer, battleship, dreadnought, carrier, even some mobile space stations were brought towards the front. They were only one sector's jump away from each other, each one seemingly staring each other down, waiting for someone to make the first move. Each one simply holding just outside any type of way of destroying each other. Humanity was ready. All their ships seemed to match up at about 140 to 1 ratio in favor of the insectoids. Though we all realized how strong humanity was, we all wondered if they had enough left over in them to release a swarm versus a swarm. We would see this as the humans seemed to get everything in formation, perfectly lined up. And we watched, we offered to bring in our own ships. And yet the humans said, no, you'll just slow us down. Go take care of your families. We got this. With that, we took our leave, but we still had our defense fleets. They were simply close enough to get a response, a video feed from the front, along with any sensor data that we could get from there as well. And what we saw truly frightened us. The humans all seemed to jump at the same time. It was not like our FTL. It was though they were folding space in itself and seemingly were in the next sector in a moment. They didn't seem to have any limits on how far they could jump, but they all jumped simultaneously, leaving an actual ripple in space that could be seen with the naked eyes. They couldn't understand what the fuck was going on. How did they all jump that way? And then from the front line, they saw that the humans were just outside of basic firing range. They were not even close enough that they could get a shot off with their ballistic weapons and be able to hit the largest of the insectoid fleets. Then suddenly they fired several of their, what did they call those again? Torpedoes? Towards the insectoid fleet. But these were not a lot. It seemed as though they wanted to test the lines as they got closer and closer. But what they did was all of a sudden go full burn, so to speak, towards the insectoid fleet. The insectoid fleet decided to do the same and went full burn towards each other, even though it would still take another 30 minutes before they were in the best firing range for each other. It was going to be a tense 30 minutes. 25 minutes out, the first round of torpedoes was going to get close, and everybody held their breath, wanting to know if these hits were going to incense the insectoids to charging into the enemy lines and tear at humanity itself. Humanity didn't even seem to be deploying any fighters yet. It was confusing what they were doing. The torpedoes themselves seemed to burst out with a strange array of light. At first, we thought this was a nuclear blast, but we didn't know what was going on at first. Then suddenly, the humanity's fleet simply stopped, firing all their retro engines at the same time, halting themselves as fast as they could. We didn't understand were they pulling back? Were they about to run? We looked at the sensor data and the video feed, and we could see as the insectoid fleet began to disintegrate. Something was eating away at the insectoid fleet. These organic fleet parts were simply coming apart. It was strange. It was though they were aging at an extremely fast rate. The outer shell, the outer carapace, began to give way and exposing the inner squishy parts to the blackness of space. Many of the inner parts started to tear themselves open from the suction that was coming from the vastness of the void, and the ships themselves were beginning to show what they were truly made out of. What they were made out of was other giant insectoids. Why they would do this? Only the Great Maker knows why. But then they not only opened themselves up and seemingly screeched out in pain, others tried to get close and began to start shedding themselves. They couldn't figure out why their own shells were coming apart. As they watched, over 100 of the ships started to fall apart at the same time. The insectoids broke formation and tried to get away from whatever was doing it. One of the motherships already started to degrade itself. It started to unravel, and then suddenly, without warning, everything happened. The human fleet fired every main gun they had at the same time, fired again directly by those the missiles with the fusion torches as they went screeching through space. Right behind them was another round of the same pair of ordnance, and then fighters were launched. These fighters again were so small, but we found out that there was no pilots. The artificial intelligence had taken care of everything and was able to take down the enemy with unforeseen precision. They would be able to get inside the lines, duck, dodge, dive, and dodge, however the human said that, and they would be able to take out as many of the insectoids as possible. What we didn't realize at first was that the first round of torpedoes was simply nanomachines. Nanomachines designed specifically to destroy organic material, the organic material that the ships were made out of. And as the first round of those ballistic weapons struck, they began to punch clean through unprotected ships. The shells themselves were gone. There was nothing there to protect them. And as those large spikes went through, they started trailing all sorts of debris, blood and guts out the back end of these ships. Many of the ships simply went adrift in space, realizing that it was a direct hit, most likely into the brain or the brain stem, or taking out the bridge. It didn't matter. The organic ship was now done. And now, as those went through and the fighters were now getting within range, everyone could see that humanity was moving their ships wider and wider and wider. And if you backed away and watched the sensor data, you realized that it was a giant spider web. One message came out against the insectoids, a strange cryptic message from the humans. "Welcome to my home," said the spider to the fly. This seemed to be a signal to all the other ships to stop spreading out and to fire as much as they could, as that was what they did. Any ordnance they knew that could reach to the insectoid fleet started flying out, and before they knew it, it wasn't 140 to 1, it was just 40 to 1, now 30 to 1, now 20 to 1. And humanity's ships did not stop. They were down to their medium weapons now. Their energy weapons could reach out as they started to streak across the sky, cutting through every single ship they touched, cutting it, burning it, sending it screeching off in the darkness, down, falling into the gravity well of the planet they were next to. Many of them were seen burning up through the atmosphere as they went down to a planet that they had taken over. The first planet that now was in humanity's sights. The insectoids on the surface were watching as their brethren burned into cinders as they fell down to the planet with a massive thud, destroying everything underneath them for miles in every direction. It was glorious as the insectoids realized that they were losing, now down to 10 to 1. Oh, no, 5 to 1. Now they're even numbers. Now there's only 70%. The humans have the advantage now. It's changing so fast, I couldn't keep a hold of it, one of them said. As all the captains watched in amazement, anyone who was watching could not understand the sheer power of what was happening. How could they have faced an enemy that outnumbered them so much, would be able to outgun them with sheer numbers? And yet, what the hell? Humanity did not stop until every single insectoid ship was down, and then they encircled the planet. It seemed as though they were waiting on something. They were. They were waiting for the scans until they found out where the hive was, where the queen was, and they fired 4 of their own large metal spikes down into the planet, going straight into the hive and killing the queen before she even knew what was going on. And with that, the insectoids lost all reason and began to attack each other. The humans seemed to watch and pay attention as the insectoids began to tear at each other with such vigor that they didn't know what to do. They were now simple creatures, simple beasts, as they teared into each and every single one of them. This was insane, they thought. The insectoid race did not go down completely without a fight, though. Deep on the far edges of the territory, one of the smaller human fleets had actually been overrun by the insectoids. They believed that they could take them out, but the insectoids had set a trap, just as the humans had. Before they realized it, the small battle group of only 4 destroyers, 6 frigates, and their accompanying fighters, no corvettes, no battleships, no anything else, was overrun before they could jump. They were able to jump out, but they did lose a single ship. This would be their only loss. But it was enough. It was enough to bring the rage of humanity even more. When they went to try and take this planet, they received a shock. There was a message coming up, and it sounded almost human. We ran it through the translator, but our translator would not be able to figure out what it was. The human translators actually were able to figure it out, but we didn't have a choice. We did not have any choice in what was happening. The humans continued their campaign until they got all the way back to the insectoids' main territory, went in at least 3 planets into their sector, leaving the home planet and 2 others. This was it. Humanity would end them. And then another message came out, but this was clearly human. They didn't understand. What was going on? Humanity was watched as they just stopped. Just straight stopped. And it wasn't until we received the video that we understood why. The crew that had been taken from the one ship that was lost were all taken prisoner, alive or dead, it didn't matter, to the home planet, to the primary queen, the one who controlled all other queens, as she looked at each of them and she did something to them. Through her own version of insectoids, some that we had never seen or only heard rumors of. They had been able to figure out the difference in male and female, figured out how humans operate, and then For the males, they had extracted all the genetic code and started to mix in their own in some ways that we still do not understand. But when they did this, they had affixed the females into the hive themselves and had impregnated them. The resulting offspring came out of the females in groups, all in eggs, all roughly about the size of a human hand, and they would come out incredibly fast. Fast for a human, that is. 1 or 2 every month or so. What came out of these eggs can only be considered a chimera, a mix between the insectoid race and the humans protected their own, so now there was a conundrum. What did they do? How did they face off against this? But there was also a conundrum for the insectoids. You see, the insectoid queens held the power because they were the only ones who could bring the offspring. But now, mixing in the human DNA the way they did, now the human females could be bred just as simple as the rest of their drones. So now what did they do? It was a standoff. Humanity demanded that all the crew members be returned. Well, of course, that couldn't be honored, as many of the crew members had been deceased for a long time. But they would return as a sign of good faith to the humans, and also a way of almost suing for peace, to show that they were not the monsters that everyone believed them to. They would return the remaining crew members. This made everyone cringe a bit as they saw the humans being brought back in medical pods, many of the pods even large for humans, and they could see that many of the females were still bulging out in their abdomen area, still being forced to breed. The resulting eggs were taken off to the side and hatched. When asked, humanity simply stated, "We don't kill kids. Not if we can help it." Many of us, we didn't understand. We were hoping that they would kill all the insectoid race off. And when we offered to take down the final 3 planets of the insectoids, we were told by the humans, no. Now we look at what was going on. Now, inside the Galactic Council, we have 2 new members. Both of them are bipedal. One seemingly squishy, no exoskeleton, an endoskeleton actually, strong for its size and very, very large, usually dressed in a lot of cloth, covering all but its hands and much of its head. This is what we would see. On the other side was another bipedal creature, but this one was stranger. This one had parts of an exoskeleton, did not wear much clothes, and had very delicate features. It was as though the insectoids realized that humanity was hard-pressed to actually strike down a woman. As we understood, that's what their humans call their females that are grown to adulthood. And now they basically set the tone for the Galactic Council, though much of us do not say anything. We just wonder, as we look at this amalgamation, this strange creature that is now not insectoid per se, but not human either, this strange chimera. Mixing that along with the war itself, we can only ask this one question. Is this what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? You get this?